let's get to this week's starts and sits. This is week 2. Michael Fabiano. You can find the entire rankings and stardom situm column at si.com. For now, though, let's go through the quarterbacks who have better matchups than usual. If they're on the bubble, this is the week to plug them in. Who are they?
All right, we'll start off with my beloved Dak Prescott, who got his bag last week, obviously. Now, he didn't have a good game last week, but that was on the road in Cleveland. Now he's at home. Last year, Linz, Dak Prescott averaged almost 25 fantasy points per game at Jerry World. Vegas has the total at around 45, so I'm expecting points to be scored. Dak Prescott is in my top 10 quarterbacks. And then Jaden Daniels. Listen, man, I had him at 15 last week. I moved him up to 12, so he was a low-end QB1. He was better than that. He's got the Giants this week. They stink. Their defense has allowed an average of more than 20 fantasy points per game. The quarterbacks on the road since last season. And so really, Lindsay, until further notice, like Jaden Daniels needs to be in your lineup.
Can I ask a quick follow there?
Yeah.
Daniel Jones. I know that it's gross. I'm talking about 2 quarterback leagues in a super flex. Do you think about starting him this week because it is the Commanders and the secondary is very bad?
The answer is, yeah, I'd start him in super flex. Last year, both Giants quarterbacks scored over 20 points against the Commanders. Tyrod Taylor and Tommy DeVito. I know you guys can't see me doing the DeVito, the Italian here thing, but yeah, I know it's bananas. I'm not drunk. My shoulder hurts, but I'm not in any sort of excruciating pain that's going to alter my mindset. I actually would play him, and I texted some people that as much, and I tweeted it out yesterday that, yeah, I would. If Jordan Love is on your team and you're in a super flex league and suddenly you're hurting, but Daniel Jones is on your roster, I don't hate it. I don't hate it. I guess that's probably as good as I can talk about Daniel
You probably
Jones.
hate that you don't hate it, but anyway, who are you
Yeah.
sitting this week?
Joe Burrow. And no, again, I have not had any strange alcoholic beverages today, but like, look at his numbers, Linz. He's averaged 14.6 points in his last 6 games dating back to last year. He scored 8 points last week against New England. The Chiefs have allowed an average of 181 passing yards per game in their last 10 home games. So their defense has really been tough on quarterbacks. You know, T. Higgins is banged up. Jamar Chase, there's all the drama with the contract. I would beware Joe Burrow, and I'd also beware Aaron Rodgers. He made his return to action last week. Good news, he didn't get hurt. Bad news, he had 8.6 points. Now, he's also averaged just 13 points in his last 19 regular season home games. Like, that's terrible. And now he's got the Titans, who have allowed an average of fewer than 15 fantasy points per game to quarterbacks visiting their home field since last year. So Aaron Rodgers is a fade for me.
Joe Burrow, EPA per drop back last week, ranked 26th with negative 0.39, just ahead of Caleb Williams and Bryce Young.
Yep.
Let's talk running backs now. Who are we starting?
Ramondre Stevenson, who I have a lot of Ramondre Stevenson because he kind of just fell to me in drafts because of the way that I drafted. He was phenomenal last week. 51 snaps, 28 touches. He had a true featured back role for the Patriots. This week, he's got the Seattle Seahawks. They have really struggled against running backs. 21 total touchdowns allowed and the 6th most fantasy points to the position since last year. And I'm going J.K. Dobbins. And yes. I know people are going to think, well, Fabs, you're chasing the points. Well, nope. If I was telling you to start him against a really good run defense, then maybe. But he's playing the Panthers.
Yes.
And you look at this matchup. Since the beginning of last year, they've allowed the 5th most fantasy points to running backs. And J.K. Dobbins rushed for 135 yards and a touchdown and 10 carries last week. That's pretty ridiculously explosive for a guy coming off Achilles and knee injuries in the last 2 years.
Yeah, Carolina allowed 180 yards rushing last week.
Yeah. Hey, man, good for him. I said it before. I'll say it again. I've always liked his talent. He just can't stay healthy. Let's hope he can this year.
Sitting. Who are we sitting?
You're going to like this one, but this is for standard leagues. And I'm going to say Rashaad White needs to be on your bench. Why? First off, the Lions defense is nasty good. They held Kyren Williams to 2.8 yards per rush last week. Okay. And they've allowed the 3rd fewest rushing yards to opposing running backs at Ford Field since last year. Bucky Irving actually looked better as a runner than White. Why would I play him in PPR? Because he can catch the ball out of the backfield. But if you're a standard league, Rashaad White is going to be a fade. And so is Zamir White. The usage was concerning last week. I mean, that's the bottom line. when
Yeah.
Alexander Madison plays more snaps and ends up scoring more fantasy points. And then you look at what this game script could be in Baltimore. If they're behind, it's going to be Madison on the field and not Zamir White. No, by the way, the Ravens have allowed just 19.8 points to running backs since the start of last season. So Zamir White needs to be on your bench.
Back to Rashaad White, 15 rush attempts, 31 rushing yards. That is a 2.1 per
It's gross.
average. Not great. Very good point there about Bucky taking over that specific role away from him in standard leagues. Wide receivers, who we starting?
Let's go with Drake London. I know we hated the Drake last week after the stinker he put up against Pittsburgh. 2 passes on 3 targets. That's gross. But Philadelphia's defense has allowed the most fantasy points to visiting wide receivers since last year. And perimeter receivers have smoked them as well. So I know London was bad last week, but I would keep the faith and start the Drake. And I would also keep the faith in Marvin Harrison Jr. And I know that the numbers were bad last week, but he played basically a full complement of snaps. I think he only missed 6 snaps in the entire game. And he's got a good matchup against the Rams. Their defense allowed a big game to Jameson Williams last week. They've given up the 6th most fantasy points to perimeter receivers since the start of last year. Keep the faith. Start Marvin Harrison Jr.
He was slow last week. I'm not saying this has nothing to do with whether you should start him or sit him, but just something on our radar. Like his top end speed was not particularly fast. And so that's something to keep our eye on this week. If he gets better or does not get better. Who are we sitting at wide receiver?
Not digging on Calvin Ridley. Last week, he had a stinker, 8 points against the Bears. He's been held to single digits in 5 of his last 7 games dating back to last year. And then you factor in Jets, 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 right? Brandon Ayuk did nothing last week. I know the Jets got beat, but that defense is still, at least in my opinion, one of the more formidable against wide receivers. So Calvin Ridley needs to be on the bench. And then Christian Watson. And all I have to say is 2 words, Malik Willis. That's it. Remember, Malik Willis has really not played significant football in the NFL since he was a rookie when he played in 8 games. During those 8 games, he was 18th in ADOT, and he was dead last in catchable target rate. He was not good at all. So I don't love Watson or any of the Packers wide receivers this week. I may be forced to start Jaden Reed. I don't think I need to be forced to start Christian Watson. I don't love anybody in Green Bay who's catching passes.
It's a really good point because you've even got like in Cleveland where Deshaun Watson, part of that was the O-line, but like he looked really bad and Amari was unplayable, right? So like the quarterback play when it goes way down like that affects all of your assets. So that's a good point. They become really scary. Tight ends. Who are we starting this week?
I have to apologize because I'm throwing out low-hanging fruit. The position is garbage, and I don't feel real comfortable telling people to start some of these middling tight ends. So I'm going to do the next best thing and give you some validation. Okay, Trey McBride had a bad game last week. All right. He had 8 points. He'll be fine this week against the Rams. Since the start of last season, their defense has given up the 4th most fantasy points at tight ends, and McBride beat them for double digits in both games last year. And I'm sticking with Mark Andrews, and I know he only had 2 targets last week, and I know Isaiah likely looked awesome. But I just can't see there being a scenario where there's not an overcorrection and he gets the looks this week. And so in a matchup against Las Vegas, and of course their defense is certainly not great, I am going to stick with Mark Andrews. I have him ranked in my top 8, and I have him ranked ahead of Isaiah Likely.
All right. I can get behind your strategy there. Just make us feel better about the guys that we are playing no matter what.
It's because so tough.
We have to.
And Linz too, even with the players that I'm going to talk about sitting, most people have to start
You can't. I know.
But like, what am I going to do? I'm going to say sit Tucker Kraft. I mean, like, that's not helping anybody. So I just want to give you guys some things to think about. Brock Bowers, really nice debut last week for the Raiders. He played 41 snaps. He was targeted 8 times. That's good. I have him, and I probably got to play him this week. But I don't love the matchup against Baltimore. They held Travis Kelce to 6.4 points last week, and tight ends have averaged just 9.1 points per game against Baltimore at M&T. So that's not good. And then Evan Ingram. Do you have to play him? Probably. He sucked last week. I mean, he did nothing. It was one of his worst stat lines of his career, 1.5 points. But what concerns me, Lindsay, is that he only played 36 snaps. So he played fewer snaps than Christian Kirk, Brian Thomas Jr., and Gabe Davis, all of them. He's got the Browns this week. They've allowed the fewest fantasy points at tight end since last year. So understandably, you may have to play him. You don't have to like it. I've got Evan Ingram as a sit. This is where we're at tight end. And this is why I said earlier in the week, Lindsay, that I would not be surprised that at some point in the future, tight end is eliminated as a position and we kind of go to just more flex players.
Let me ask about a tight end that
Okay.
I think people are probably thinking they might start and maybe wouldn't have last week, and that's Colby Parkinson, who had a pretty
Yeah,
big
I've got,
role with the
yep,
Rams.
yep.
Relative, I mean, it was an awful week for tight end, right? But
Yeah.
relative to what everyone else did, he was playable. His usage was pretty good.
We talk about looking at stats and looking beyond like receptions, yards, and touchdowns and fantasy points and looking at snaps played.
Mhm.
And Colby Parkinson played a ton of snaps. Now that was an overtime game. If memory serves me, I think he played like 60 or 70 snaps in that game. So that's a ton. He's on the field. And now you have
Ran
no Puka.
routes. Yeah.
So right, routes run as well. Great example, right? I mean, that's another thing you got to look at. And he did both. And so I'm actually going to play him in one of my leagues. I have Njoku. I can't play him. I'm going to play Parkinson. So he is an acceptable replacement. And let's hope that those routes run and those snaps played equate to 8 to 10 points, which at this point we're happy with at tight end.